Hello and welcome to the second episode of Unpacking Pakistan. The issue we're talking about today is something that has affected every person in various cities across Pakistan. So, according to estimates by the World Bank, air pollution is currently costing Pakistan about 6% of its GDP. This year, Punjab has been hit the worst, with an unprecedented number of AQI reaching 1900 in cities like Multan and Lahore. Schools have been shut down, there have been bans on heavy traffic, and personally, the feeling that lots of people had was very similar to COVID, that sense of hypervigilance, of not feeling safe, and the kind of uncertainty that surrounded us. Of course, what's also really alarming is all the facts and figures that are coming out about the effect of smog on life expectancy. So, a lot of parents that I've talked to have really expressed concerns over the emotional weight, for example, that they're carrying of knowing they're raising their children here, right? And we know okay, about 1.9 million people reportedly ended up in hospitals in these months this year across Punjab. Lots of these people are people who had pre-existing respiratory illnesses, etc. So this is something we want to talk about, and we want to kind of we want to address some of the misconceptions and misinformation about this topic as well, right? So if you talk to an average person, there are lots of theories that are flying out about what is causing smog. ये हवा, ये जो बुरी हवा है, ये इंडिया से आ रही है, ये कहाँ से आ रही है? So we want to kind of address those issues as well. And the second issue we're talking about today is something that is systemic, it's long term, and it's also linked with smog, but more broadly with climate change in Pakistan, with sustainability. And this is the issue of the unchecked and unplanned and kind of unregulated growth of cities that we're seeing across Pakistan, right? So this phenomena is known as urban sprawl in kind of academic speak, but what it really means is when cities grow beyond the peripheries, beyond the planned kind of limits of the city. And it causes a range of problems for people, right? We know it causes issues for water, for sanitation. The quality of life in many of these areas is very, very poor. And so we want to kind of tackle A, the smog issue, B, the whole issue of urbanization in Pakistan, right? If we look at the facts, in sort of 1950, 17% of Pakistan's population was living in urban areas. अगर हम 2024 को देख रहे हैं, now roughly 40% of people in Pakistan are living in urban areas, and it's projected कि अगर ये इसी rate पे urbanization चलती रहे, तो about 50% of Pakistan will be living in cities by the next 5 years or so, right? And Pakistan is the most rapidly urbanizing country when it comes to South Asia. So to talk about these things, I think I'm like super excited, and I think there couldn't have been any two kind of better guests on this subject. Both the guests who are joining me today are people whose work I have been reading, whose work I have watched and admired over the years. And so I want to now turn to kind of introduce my first guest. So my first guest is Dr. Umair Javed, who is an assistant professor of sociology and politics at the Gurmani School of Humanities and Social Sciences at LUMS. Umair Javed's research looks at the politics of urban development, accumulation, and labor relations in the informal economy. His research has been widely published in various journals, including Catalyst and Economic and Political Weekly, but he's perhaps most well known for his fortnightly columns in Dawn, which lots of people read. He covers current affairs, he talks about cultural and social issues in his Dawn articles. Thank you, Umair, so much for being here with us today. My second guest is Dr. Mariam Ibrahim. She is a human geographer and assistant professor in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at LUMS. Her work adopts a policy focus with various forms of spatial and data analysis. Her research covers population, housing analysis, urban and environmental policy, and planning projects. Her publications include very interesting explorations of gender disconnects in urban improvement programs, especially for Kachi Abadis. She has been a consultant at the World Bank and has been a lead consultant at the Urban Unit. Thank you so much, Mariam, for being with us today for this episode.
Thank you.
So I want to kind of start by getting to the heart of this debate. Lots of things that we're seeing now, we know they aren't like just something that has been caused in the present. They have long antecedents that have led to this moment. So I want to start with you, Umair, and I want to ask you basically, और ये बहुत ही लंबा जवाब बनता है इस सवाल का, but let's try to kind of talk maybe about the last 10 years. How did we get here? When we look at like urban trends and urban policy, कि cities की planning कैसी हो रही थी? What are kind of major trends we're seeing that impacted where and how Pakistan cities have grown by 2024?
Yeah, thank you, Nika. You're right. The answer could potentially be very long, but I'll try to sort of focus on a couple of things that are relevant to the last 10 years in particular. So I think one of the things that has really sort of stood out has been the issue of urban sprawl. That our cities have expanded in a particular way, which is mostly through low density, single family units being built, eating into what we call sort of the peri-urban or agrarian hinterland of most urban centers, right?
So, what is low density? I just want us to break this down.
Low density essentially means that a large amount of space is being used to house a relatively small number of people. And we can come up with more technical or numerical definitions. But generally, the pattern that we see in most major urban centers is this idea that the cities have expanded into the rural hinterland, the rural areas that surround them. And most of that development has taken place that occupy large amounts of land, or that have converted large amounts of agricultural land, but housing relatively small number of people. So that is the one major trend that we see sort of taking place. And the trend is not new. I mean, we have to be clear that from the early 20th century onwards, this has been the standard mode of expansion for Pakistani cities, especially those that had large rural hinterlands to begin with. So Karachi ki development has been slightly different because Karachi is bounded by the sea on one end and by sort of semi-arid, and desert land on the other. So Karachi saw vertical development and increased densification fairly early on. But across most of Punjab, and especially the GT road belt, right, so between from pretty much Peshawar all the way down to Multan, these were large agricultural tracts and where urban centers actually grew into the surrounding rural areas, right? So this has been the standard pattern of development. But this pattern has accelerated over the last 10, 20 years, right? And part of that has been because of the influx of what we call private capital, right? So private investors sort of entering into this realm and developing housing schemes and sort of planned developments in the rural areas using agricultural land, converting them into housing. And sort of that's the nature of urban development. The second pattern that is closely linked to it has been the development of private vehicular centered infrastructure. Matlab yani ki whereas you have sprawl on one hand, you also have a consistent underfunding of public transport, meaning that people have to rely on private motor vehicles, right? So private motor vehicles include cars, obviously most dominantly, but also more numerically, we are talking about motorcycles and auto rickshaws, so 2 and 3 wheelers, right? So these two patterns collectively are what, in my view, define urban development in Pakistan. Ek taraf you have increasing sprawl, that cities have expanded horizontally. The area that they now occupy is much larger than what they occupied, or the footprint that they now occupy is much larger than what they occupied a few years ago. And at the same time, connectivity is made possible only by private modes of transport instead of public transport or mass transit. That is what the pattern is that we historically see in many other parts of the world. So these two trends are what I would see as sort of the more dominant ones over the last 10, 15 years.
And is this like specific to Pakistan, or do you think in South Asia generally in the last sort of 10 or 20 years, this is the trend we're seeing?
So I think that's a really important point, that there is variation in South Asia. So the Punjab pattern, or the pattern that we see along the GT road belt, has been replicated in parts of Indian Punjab as well. But many other parts of India, for example, in say the case of the South, cities have tended to expand vertically rather than horizontally. Yani ki cities have built into more dense, using mid-rise and high-rise construction. And the other thing that sets Pakistan apart from the South Asian context is the absence of systematic interventions in public transport. So India there are now 7 cities which have large-scale mass transit solutions. Pakistan to date, Lahore is the only one that has rail-based mass transit, and then you have metro buses in a bunch of other locations. The only other place where we see similar patterns of development are in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, where sprawl has been similar in nature. But not to sort of get into Pakistani exceptionalism, but I do think that the case, and many scholars have documented this, that what we see in Pakistan is a bit distinctive in the very nature of sprawl that seems to be taking place here.
That's exactly what I was trying to get a sense of. Okay, so vehicles, like private ownership of vehicles, you said, and then low density and the influx of capital right? That has been important also for this real estate,
Yeah.
this entire sector. Okay. I want to turn to you, Mariam, here. And now that when we talk about cities and the way cities have grown, basically the major current issue we're seeing with residents living in cities like Lahore, etc., is smog, right? Now, according to a report published by the Urban Unit in 2023, when we look at the major contributors to air pollution, जब sectoral emissions को देखें, the figures that I found in this report were that transport is accounting roughly for 39%, they've said, industry roughly 24%, energy is 16%, and agriculture is at 11%. और जहां तक मुझे पता है उसके बाद एक और भी रिपोर्ट आई है, आई बिलीव, जो शायद पंजाब गवर्नमेंट की आई है, या देयर हैव बीन लाइक वेरियस कन्वर्सेशंस की रिपोर्ट कितनी ट्रू है, नहीं है, एटसेट्रा. सो इफ वी टेक जस्ट अ स्टेप बैक फ्रॉम दीज statistics, I want to ask you what actually causes smog. Most people have no idea about this, and how do kind of these various sectors play into it.
Thank you, Nika. I know there's so many confusions with regards to smog. What is causing smog? Why does it happen in these months? Why in this region? Why doesn't it, happen in other months, and so on and so forth? And all of that closely relates to the causes of smog. So you're right. There has been a lot of information that we all have seen spreading on social media and so on that gives us these figures. So initially, about 2 years or so ago, we had the Urban Unit publishing statistics that said that transportation sector was responsible for 83% of the emissions, followed then by the industrial pollution that was causing 9% of the emissions, air pollution, followed by the energy sector at 4%, and then crop burning at 3%. We've had a revision of it just now, like you were mentioning. There has been this revision that was published by the CM and in their mitigation plan. And this is the statistics. Essentially, these statistics also come from the Urban Unit, but now they put a lesser percentage allocation for transport, but it's still the highest at 39%, like you stated. And so this is a contentious debate because it leads towards certain bans on certain, industries during the periods of smog. But what is important here is that smog is a complex phenomena and it occurs due to several factors coming together. And so it's very important for us to kind of understand that. So going back to your question of what really causes smog, in Pakistan, if we are to really look at the reasons, there is anthropogenic air pollution, so human-induced air pollution, that is met alongside with natural factors that occur, natural geographic factors that occur at this point in time in this region specifically. And so if we look at it, there is sulfur smog, or what we've commonly known as the London smog, which is caused by when we use, sulfur, essentially sulfur containing fossil fuels, and we burn them. In Pakistan, we do that through industrial activities and through power generation, whether that's through proper or improper methods. And so essentially we see brick kilns using burning coal, or steel manufacturing factories burning coal. And so we have the sulfur smog. But what is more apparent in terms of looking at the air pollutants in the air is photochemical smog, which comes, and I'm sorry for getting too technical about this, but just give me a minute. And so essentially, when we look at this photochemical smog, it includes nitrogen oxides and VOCs. VOCs are volatile organic compounds, and I'll explain what those are. But basically, nitrogen oxides are, a result of burning fossil fuels. They're a result of vehicular emissions. They're a result of industrial activities. And VOCs are they maintain our ecosystem, but then humans are adding pressure onto it and increasing their load in terms of vehicular, again, exhausts, industrial processes, and of course use of through fossil fuels, but also through paints and solvents and cleaning products. So it's being emitted in our daily lives as well. But it's not as easy and direct as we would want it to be. So it's not like these certain factories are polluting nitrogen oxide, and so we can just curb this. There's a lot in play. So at this time and while these air pollutants are hazardous in nature themselves individually, what is important here is that at this point in time, post the monsoon period in Pakistan and India, we have dry weather conditions, we have calm winds, and we have abundant sunlight. Now, this creates the perfect opportunity for smog to be created, photochemical smog. And in when we have abundant sunlight, there are reactions of nitrogen oxides and VOCs coming together. And the creation of ground level ozone, which is essentially the reason why we could feel the burning sensation in our respiratory tracts and in our eyes. And so essentially, this is one of the major air pollutants. And the other contributor that comes up is the particulate matter, PM 2.5 and PM 10, with the words that we've been hearing continuously. And essentially what this includes is dust, ash, but also other chemicals that are emitted through different, factories, vehicles, but also that are caused through chemical reactions in the air. And so essentially these include sulfates, nitrates, carbonaceous particles, and so on. And now when this stage has been set for the smog to perfectly submerge a city, it gets even worse because of thermal inversion. As the air starts to cool down, this now hot air cannot rise. Because hot air rises, the cool air starts to get trapped. And essentially what we then see is smog not being able to dissipate, which makes it even worse.
So I'm going to ask you like a very basic layman question. कि यही phenomena है जो कहा जा रहा है कि because of the current fog, like the fog that was specific to this month, we had like in November this level of smog because it couldn't actually dissipate. Is that like what you're kind of saying or no?
No, so fog used to happen in later months. Fog was always a phenomenon of Lahore that happened in December or January. And so fog is more of a phenomena that is attached to sulfurous smog. So the one that I mentioned initially, in which coal and the emissions coming from coal burning and fog come together, and essentially that creates that sulfurous smog. But photochemical smog occurs in drier areas so post monsoon. And so essentially what we see here then is this worsening impact due to thermal inversion. When we think of all these factors, we need to pinpoint technical reasons and potential changes that can come about. And so we see that vehicular pollution is a common source in each one of those pollutants that I mentioned. Therefore, switching to Euro 5 and Euro 6 standard fuel is important. Mandating that all vehicles get catalytic converters. There are annual health checks of vehicles are all important. But then we also need to dig deeper into the forces behind it. And I go back to what Umair was discussing here in terms of how our cities are expanding, right? So our cities have doubled or tripled in size in the past few years. And that has, of course, had major repercussions on smog, for example. And why is that? Because when cities have grown in size, population densities have reduced, travel times have increased, and that has a bearing on how on how much transportation we need. And essentially, because like Umair said, we have not had a public focus on public transport at all. And so essentially, we're focusing on individual vehicle ownership. In just 10 years, and so you were talking about how the number of vehicles has increased. The number of vehicles has tripled in Punjab. So starting from 7.5 million just 10 years ago, we're at 21.1 million. Yeah. And out of this 21.1 million, 17.5 are motorcycles.
That's a huge shift. Yeah, these are staggering numbers.
Exactly. And motorcycles often use low quality oil. So the problem worsens because of this. And when this is added up with crop burning, crop residue burning, industrial activities, and power generation, it leads towards the hazardous levels of smog that we've been experiencing.
Okay, no, I mean, honestly, like I had no idea about a lot of this. So this is so helpful to learn. And I think most people actually don't. Like people just, will watch like a short clip on something that makes the news, like a viral meme or something, and they have no idea about all of this. So thanks so much. That was so clear. And I'm gonna ask you later on about inequality and the link between the way smog is affecting the lives of people in different parts of the city. But before we get to that, I want to turn to Umair and I want to ask you. So now we're turning to like the major, I think, like topic that I was thinking about when I conceptualized like the questions for this episode and why we're doing this. was actually at the heart of it. और मैंने अपने notes में लिखा हुआ है bracket में कि अमीर पाकिस्तान और गरीब पाकिस्तान, कि हम एक पाकिस्तान में नहीं रह रहे, अमीर पाकिस्तान है, गरीब पाकिस्तान है, middle class पाकिस्तान भी, and we also know वो भी एक नहीं है, उसकी भी various levels है, but it's basically inequality, right? Like, so my question is कि the way cities have expanded, the way this private ownership of vehicles, there are so many aspects to it. क्या major kind of effects हुए हैं that have made the lives of different people in Lahore and various other cities in Pakistan so unequal? What are those various kind of like elements to this?
Yeah, thanks, Rika. I think what's important is to sort of focus in on certain tangible measures of inequality, right? So what does inequality actually look like? How does inequality manifest in our urban centers? So this manifestation of inequality takes several forms. There is housing inequality, which basically means that a small portion of the population has access to abundant housing. यानी कि एक तबका है जिसके पास बहुत सी ऑप्शंस हैं कि उनको किस किस्म का घर मिल सकता है, कहाँ मिल सकता है और क्या. And then you have a vast segment of the population that is confined to a much smaller number of housing, right? Or smaller types or options available for housing. ठीक है? So housing inequality is a very central aspect. So one statistic that comes out very starkly is that in the city of Lahore, 70% of Lahore's population resides in housing that is 3 rooms or less. ठीक है? And we're talking about an average household size of 6.5. ठीक है? So 6.5 people are residing in houses that have 3 rooms or less, with the vast plurality of this being concentrated in houses with 2 rooms or less. So households being confined, right? But then you also have about 8% of households that have access to housing with room numbers that exceed 6 or 7. ठीक है? So this just goes to show the nature of inequality as far as housing is concerned. So that's one major manifestation of inequality. The housing market and the development of the housing market has happened in such a form that a small number of people have access to a much wider array of options, and a large number of people have access to very small and inadequate nature of options. ठीक है? उसके अलावा then we look at other types of urban inequalities. So for example, access to services. A very simple example from that would be of solid waste management. Is someone coming to your house or to your street to pick up your trash? Or does the trash accumulate at the end of your street to a point where it reaches a sort of a particular threshold, and only after that does someone come in or you have to do something about it, right? So solid waste management, many people who belong to the upper middle class or the upper class will not really know what is happening to their trash, because there is a system, there's a system in place that but many people, for example, who reside in informal settlements or in urban villages, which is a phenomenon that we can discuss later on, they have to deal with the question of solid waste on a regular basis, right? They either have to manage it themselves or they have to pool in resources and create a system whereby solid waste gets scattered. So that's another aspect of inequality that we see. A third aspect of service-related inequality is access to water. ठीक है? So when you turn on the tap, does the water flow? Does it only flow 2 times a day? Or does it not flow at all? And do you have to go somewhere else to access water? Right? So if you again look at sort of this particular relationship, you will see that a smaller portion of households in a city like Lahore will have uninterrupted access to water through the week, through the months, through the year. Whereas others will have to time their water use because water only comes in twice a day, once in the morning, once in the evening.
Yes.
Closely related to this is the issue of water quality, right? So 2 neighborhoods, one that caters to sort of an upper income population and one that caters to a lower income population, in close proximity to one another, can have starkly different types of water quality, right? And there's excellent research done by our colleague Dr. Ameem and Dr. Nausheen Zaidi on the issue of water contamination. And what they found is that there is a widespread problem of E. coli and fecal matter contamination in water supply across cities like Lahore, where low-income settlements such as Chungi Amar Sidhu, for example, upwards of 45-50% of all water samples have shown to be contaminated with a whole host of dangerous bacteria, right? So that is another way in which inequality sort of can manifest itself. And then there are sort of other metrics that we can use. Energy access is one. Do you have access to, for example, piped natural gas? Do you get load shedding? What is the amount of load shedding that you get? So there are various ways in which urban inequality sort of, is created. And again, I want to sort of stress upon the fact that urban inequality is not unique to the Pakistani context. You have urban inequities formed in any places, including in very developed sort of countries as well. But the nature of urban inequity or inequality that we see emerging in Pakistani cities poses an almost existential threat to the population, right? And I think that is what makes it such a pressing problem for us. Housing inadequacy, service delivery inadequacy in solid waste management, in water, in sanitation, these pose actual health hazard concerns for the population. And that is why they need to be looked at and need to be worked on.
Very this is very helpful. And I want to just talk a bit more about, so a lot of your work is about the informal economy. And jo aapne baat ki ke various levels of like housing. So that percent jinke paas 3 rooms ya less hai, ya 2 rooms hai, a lot of those people are people who are working in the informal sector. So can you say a bit more about what is the informal economy? What is the informal sector? Who are these people?
So I mean, the textbook definition of the informal economy is all income generating activity that is unregulated in a context where similar activity may be regulated by state institutions, right? So I mean, that's a very it's what we sort of usually use to classify it. But in sort of more practical terms, the informal economy is basically labor and income generating activity that is carried out without legal protections, that is carried out on a non-contractual or verbal contractual basis, that is carried out largely for the for subsistence related purposes. कि आपने अपनी रोजमर्रा की जिंदगी की जरूरियात पूरी करनी है, तो उसके लिए आप कुछ ना कुछ कामकाज जो है वो अपने करने की कोशिश करते हैं. उसमें स्ट्रीट वेंडिंग है, होम बेस्ड वर्क है, उसके अंदर डोमेस्टिक वर्क आ जाता है, कोई छोटी मोटी किसी ने मैकेनिक की दुकान लगाई हुई है, किसी ने ठेला लगाया हुआ है. All of these things are, and these generally tend to be more precarious in the sense कि the livelihood जो है उसकी एक जो आप कह सकते हैं कि सस्टेनेबिलिटी जो होती है वो कम होती है, उसकी रेगुलरिटी कम होती है. इट पोजेस यू टू ऑल सॉर्ट्स ऑफ रिस्क्स. द पर्सन हु रन्स फॉर एग्जांपल अ स्टॉल, राइट, सेलिंग फ्रूट, is exposed to environmental hazards, is exposed to political disturbances कि भाई अब शहर बंद हो गया, आप ठेला नहीं लगा सकते. So there is a great deal of precarity, of precariousness that is associated with the informal economy. और informal economy की एक reflection जो है वो हमें housing में भी नजर आती है, which is through what we call unplanned or unregulated housing development.
This is actually very illuminating because I've never thought of it this way, but like the levels of precarity, so environment se bhi over affect honge, unrest se bhi honge, so that lack of stability kind of marks their occupation. Whereas other professions will be more stable, the salaries are clear, consistent, etc. Okay, I think this is actually a good kind of segue to the next question that I wanted to ask, which is we can talk about like roads, we can talk about infrastructure, we can talk about income. These are more kind of ostensible external things. But there's like an assumption that the air we breathe is the same for everyone. Like that is an assumption that I think characterizes just kind of human society or civilization or the way we want to think about human life, right? Even in a developing country like Pakistan. And what we've seen recently is that equality is not there, right? We know different parts of Lahore and other cities in Punjab have been affected by smog in different ways. So ज़्यादा affluent areas पे AQI different आ रहा है, और जगहों पे जहाँ कम green है, कम trees है, वहाँ different आ रहा है, right? So can you tell us a bit about this inequality with relation to smog, like the experience of smog, और वो किस तरह tie in कर रहा है with existing inequalities and maybe even with like creating new inequalities?
So you're right, Anika. When we think about smog, we felt like the whole city was submerged in smog. We felt like we were all equally breathing in the smog. But there were differences even within the city. If you looked at the map of AQI, you could essentially see that there were different areas that had different levels, while some affluent neighborhoods also had high levels of AQI, primarily because there was these new housing schemes have construction going on. So construction sites cause greater suspension of particulate matter that leads towards greater AQI levels in those areas. But that does not mean that we are all exposed to smog in the same way or that we're all affected by smog in the same way. And so photochemical smog that I started off explaining here occurs more in heavily industrialized areas and areas that have greater vehicular traffic. So we had greater air pollution levels in cases of, we had in cases of Egerton Road, Davis Road in Lahore, Shimla Pahari, the railway station. And then we had green lockdowns in these areas also because of the greater air pollution in these areas. Now, apart from high population density areas with greater economic and commercial activities, the incidence of smog is also worsened in low-income neighborhoods. So like you were saying, that they're bearing essentially the brunt here. Unfortunately, we don't have air quality monitors installed in those sites where we can actually see the differences. But low-income neighborhoods are often situated closer to industrial sites. And so that is where the concentration of nitrogen oxides and VOCs is. And so essentially a greater level of smog in those areas. While geolocation matters, the internal facilities and conditions in those housing society, in those low-income housing neighborhoods also matter, whether it's informal housing or regularized. They have issues like, for example, they don't have gas connections, so they use alternate forms of methods for cooking, which leads towards greater suspension of particulate matter into the air, burning of firewood, and so on. Many of these low-income neighborhoods also don't have paved roads, so that also leads towards dust suspension, a greater aggravated level of smog. If we think about it, also in looking outside of these settlements, talking about what you were discussing in terms of informality, if you have a white-collar job, you're in an office, you're in a closed environment, you're not exposed to smog in the same ways in which someone working outside, someone in the informal economy is actually being exposed to. And so, irrespective of their location, they're also exposed to all these forms of vulnerabilities. And then, of course, while there is greater exposure to vulnerabilities, there is also lesser adaptation. So just from the top of my head, if we think about air purifiers, not a very small percentage of people could actually afford air purifiers or even the N95 masks, right, for their whole family. Exactly. And or that who can seal their home shut. So who have proper windows, who have proper doors that seal their home shut, to that, which even if you don't have an air purifier, at least you're indoors. But many people don't have that. And then if we think about the government's reactionary strategy and policy to when in this intense periods of smog was to close down schools. Goes down primary and secondary schools and move online. But then only people who have Android mobiles or Android phones, or who have computers or tablets could actually, with internet connections, could actually access education. So we see inequalities with access to education also coming as a result of smog. And then, of course, what is most important here is that a very small percentage of people actually had access to information. So if you don't have access to information, right, how do you address these issues? How do you protect yourself from them? And so the fact that there is not enough information disbursement, there is misinformation, confusions being created, creates these vulnerabilities and exacerbates these vulnerabilities even more.
Yeah. I mean, it's like making me think of so many like further questions. This digital, like is jo hum kar rahe, digital almost like black down with the net, with the internet going all the time, right? It makes an uncertain situation even more uncertain for so many people. There's a follow-up question जो मेरे mind में तब से stuck है since your last question, so I have to ask the people that we were talking about when we talk about this informal economy. Are most of these people rural migrants?
Well, I mean, that's certainly one large part of it. So if you look at the data from Pakistan, it's quite clear that employment in the informal economy is also closely correlated with your migrant status. So if you move to the city, especially if your background was in agricultural labor, it's likely that you will find work in the informal economy. And a large reason for large part of why that happens is because of sort of the absence of credentials or skills that that would allow you to get more stable forms of employment. So the first port of call is to either work in the service sector as a helper, a shop helper, for example, a loader, someone doing physical manual labor, or setting up something of your own, like becoming a street vendor, or working in the domestic care industry or something like that. So rural migration is certainly a big part of it. But then a lot of it also is down to just the fact that poverty is transmitted intergenerationally, right? So it is possible that that families that have been stuck in poverty and are unable to sort of gain a level of subsistence that would allow them to invest in skills and sort of credentials, or do not have opportunities or access to resources for that to happen. You can see that their employment in the informal economy might actually be persisting over several generations, even if they had previously even been residing in urban areas, right? But that is certainly a smaller part of the problem. I think a large part of our city growth is still based on rural to urban migration. And I think that is why informality and inequity in access to services and employment is also pretty, it remains pretty high.
Okay. जब लाहौर की बात करते हैं, again we're coming back to housing now. So there are kind of various formats for like residential units, right? Like we have gated housing communities, like these big ones like Askari, Falcon, etc. We have smaller societies catering to like lower income households, and then we have of course large numbers of slums also, right? So I'm thinking कि ये जो this kind of like stratification that we see within Lahore, where as you said earlier, very close by, like within whatever hundreds of kilometers दूर आपको एक developed area से आपको बिल्कुल एक different किस्म का की neighborhood मिलेगी, आपको slums मिलेंगे. How has this happened, and I mean, is there like a way to go beyond this? क्या ये आपको permanent नजर आ रहा है? इसका क्या है future?
So I think the pattern of development has actually been pretty consistent over the last 100 or so years. And it sounds very strange because we've been talking about this from a very contemporary perspective. But actually, if you look at most cities, again, in Pakistan, the cities historically used to be centered around an old urban core, जो walled city होती थी या historic जो settlement होती थी. But after colonialism, you saw the expansion of that city in the form of planned development, especially initially for colonial offices. So, British offices उनके लिए बनती थी. और फिर that segment of the native population that had obtained Western education, that had become part of the colonial administration and so on, right? But as population pressures grew, especially after independence in 47, governments of the time decided that we need to expand out further, that we need to accommodate these new populations that have come into the cities, either because of partition and partition-related migration or rural to urban migration, right? And so we see the onset of this this urban sprawl, right? So Lahore, if you look at the case of Lahore, there's a historic core, then there's the colonial city, and then there's the city that has emerged in the post-colonial context or after independence in sort of the last 7 or so decades, and all of it is based on the conversion of agricultural land into urban development. Okay? So initially that urban development of that conversion was being done by the state. So it was either being done by the Lahore Improvement Trust originally or by the Lahore Development Authority eventually after the 1970s. What changes from the 1980s onwards is the influx of private developers catering to a particular section of the housing market, right? So the rise of what we would call gated communities or private communities really kicks off from the late 1980s, 1990s onwards. Okay? And there the argument was that everyone wants a bungalow, everyone wants a single unit house for themselves. Intergenerational family की भी fragmentation होती है. As nuclear families, sort of as extended families break up into nuclear families, so everyone wants a household of their own. And so to cater to that demand, people were willing to travel further out from the city center. Okay? So they were, पहले ही होता था कि you would be close to the city center, but because of the rise of private vehicles, private modes of transport, it suddenly became feasible to live 20, 25, 30 kilometers away from the city center as long as you had access to private transport. So that sort of led to at least one particular pattern of development. But very closely associated to that pattern of development was that you weren't necessarily going into land that was unoccupied. That land had a history of its own as well, right? And that history was that land was being farmed by communities who used to live in village settlements. So ultimately what we see is this very distinctive phenomenon where housing schemes have emerged on ex-rural areas, but in very close proximity to big villages or sort of old villages where people who used to farm those sort of areas actually resided. So what we now think of as slums, the term is, I think, in some ways also slightly misleading because the term in the South Asian context usually refers to an informal settlement. A group of people came, they squatted on a piece of land and they built something from scratch. In the Pakistani context, the most common form of low-income housing that we see is actually this urban village phenomenon, which is that these villages that were historically, these village communities that were historically farming land, and that land gets used up for private residential development, and the village remains in place. Okay? And so that basically becomes the area where a lot of your low income, especially rural to urban migrants, will actually find housing, because it's a pocket of land where housing exists, which is still affordable, which can still be developed in a densified fashion, and it's surrounded by these elite or sort of upper income or upper middle class private developments, जो कि gated होती हैं, जिनमें obviously the cost of land is very high, the cost of a house is very high, and so that is only accessible to a small percentage of the population. So you have this dual pattern where people who have the ability to buy housing or can afford formal housing, they will move out into these sort of former rural areas, and people who don't have access to these developed or planned sort of gated housing communities, they will end up in those village settlements, which in many ways actually resemble informal settlements, but the legal status is obviously different because they were historically sort of recognized formal settlements as villages, right? So that's the nature of this development that we see, and it's not just again true for Lahore. This is happening in Islamabad. It's happening in Rawalpindi. It's happening in Gujranwala, in Faisalabad, in Multan, in all of these cities. As the city expands outwards, it engulfs former village settlements, and those village settlements ultimately become the only form of housing that is available to rural to urban migrants who are low income, or for people who might be who might be looking for housing in those urban centers.
Okay. So in a way, they do find like an option for like living there and earning, but then again वही बात की वो जो सारे public goods की distribution
है, public goods की distribution का मसला है, housing inadequacy है, space का issue है, all of those things are compounded in those territories, in those particular neighborhoods. But yes, those are the only source of those are the only types of housing that are available.
Option that's kind of available to them. So building on what you just said, you've written a lot about citizenship, right, and unequal citizenship across Lahore for different people of the city. Can you just unpack this notion of citizenship for us? Ye hai kya basically?
So, I mean, citizenship, what we call Shariat, right? So, citizenship is usually conceptualized in terms of, or it's conceived of in terms of, in terms of the state, in terms of authority or governmental authority, right? That people have a certain set of rights and obligations in front of a particular state or in front of a particular governmental authority, right? But I'm interested in citizenship as it manifests in the lived experience of a city, right? So isko hum urban citizenship kehte hain. Urban citizenship ka concept jo hai is basically tied to the idea that on paper we all enjoy equal political or what we call fundamental rights, right? That we all have an ID card. That ID card does not distinguish between the ID card number. You can't tell from the ID card number that who belongs to what class, who belongs to what. Everyone is technically a citizen and an equal citizen. That is the basis of Republican sovereignty, which is jiski basis pe modern jo mulk hain ya modern countries hain, wo bani hai. And yet we know for a fact that citizenship does not, and in the words of Patrick Heller, citizenship does not abate class. Yani ke citizenship cannot override class, right? So the entire question that I'm interested in, and I'm a very junior scholar in this realm, and a lot of people have talked about this, is how does your experience of the city actually sort of, how far does it deviate from the idea of equality of citizenship? Right? If someone opens a tap in their house and they get water which is highly contaminated to the extent that their child suffers from biological deficiencies in the form of stunting, in the form of waterborne diseases, right? That their growth in terms of both their brain matter, but also in terms of the physical body is compromised because of water quality, right? And someone else who lives 100 meters away or 200 meters away opens up a tap and the water there is perfectly drinkable. The children are growing up to be perfectly healthy with complete sort of use of sort of their the complete evolution of mental faculties and so on. So I think that becomes a sort of a really important lens to, or at least citizenship then provides us with a really important lens to evaluate the nature of inequality and the nature of sort of the inequities that we find in this particular in particular urban context, right? So in the case of Pakistan, and specifically in the areas that that we do research in, for us the question of citizenship is a question of how do you access services, and what are the types of services that are available to you, and what is the quality of those services, right? And is this differentiation of service provision, the kind of services that you're getting, is it divided, or does it map onto differences in socioeconomic background? Okay? So ultimately, that's what just because you were born into into a well-to-do family, does that mean that throughout your lifespan you will have access to better services?
Yeah.
And if you had the misfortune of being born into a low-income family or a deprived household, will you always have sort of an inadequate access to these various urban services that are essential to how we go about our day-to-day lives?
Yeah. And I mean, this is a monumental theme actually, because it's really about upward social mobility, and can people escape the circumstances they were born into, and can they actually practically change their lives,
Right.
and how many generations does that take, right? So it's like a really actually important thing you're working on. Mariam, I'm coming to again, this always makes me laugh, jo puri misinformation or rumors hain about smog. So there's been this very funny video where the Indian CM is saying कि मुझे मरियम का फोन आया था और वो कह रही है कि जो हवा यहाँ की है वो कीड़ियाँ खा रही है और वो उधर से इधर आ गई है, और हमें ये दिल्ली वाले भी ये कहते हैं, तो हम क्या करें, हमारी हवा कहाँ कहाँ जा रही है. ये जो क्रॉस बॉर्डर पोल्यूशन एक्चुअली उसका कितना इम्पैक्ट है. और एक और चीज मैंने यहाँ पूछनी है, because we were both kind of working together in the Lahore Binale recently, which Mariam was organizing, and we were just walking after a session and we were talking, and you said very casually that I wish people knew that ये सिर्फ climate change is not the direct cause of the smog we're seeing. And there was this very funny, interesting moment where I acted very normal about it, but I didn't know this. It's like those hilarious moments where you're with a friend and she says something, and I said, and I think we had that conversation then. I think Mariam should talk about this in the podcast. So, क्या link है between climate change, और क्या link है between cross-border pollution and smog?
Okay. So, I'll start with climate change. So, essentially, there is a lot of misinformation with regards to it. Climate change can exacerbate the problem. It can worsen smog. It can act as an aggravating factor, but it is not the main cause of smog. So, what we need to understand here is, and so we can't place the blame on the global north for this. This is our fault.
We have to carry it ourselves.
Yeah, we have to carry it ourselves. This is a regional problem. It is our localized emissions that have led to the chemical reactions that have caused smog. Now, what we saw this year was unprecedented levels of smog, literally. And climate change may play a factor in aggravating the levels. And so I'll tell you how, and I'll go slightly technical here. And so climate change, it causes heat waves, it causes cold spells, it causes untimely seasonal variation, it causes changes in precipitation levels and patterns, it causes extreme events like floods and droughts. Now, so essentially, it doesn't cause smog in the sense that it is not the root cause of smog, but it can play a role in terms of elongating the dry spell. Okay. So when the dry spell is elongated, then smog, it's more difficult for the smog to dissipate during that time. There is no rainfall during that time, so essentially smog gets more and more dense. Or for example, a heat wave may cause for smog to worsen also. So essentially we need adequate sunlight, we need heat essentially for the reactions of nitrogen oxides and VOCs to create the ozone, to create the ground level ozone. And so then essentially that ground level ozone will be much more than what would have otherwise occurred. And so climate change is partially responsible for aggravating the problem, but we need to understand that it is our emissions and it is a regional problem.
Can we blame India? We need someone to blame, right?
Yeah.
Can we do that?
And so essentially, we always want someone to blame. So there has been a lot of to and fro, and that comment coming from the Indian CM was funny in a way, because India says that the smog is coming from Pakistan. Pakistan says that the smog is coming from India. And the reality is that India and Pakistan are located on the Indo-Gangetic plains. Yeah. Now, they share the monsoons, and so essentially moisture-laden air comes from the east to the west. and they collectively share what we call photochemical smog. And so essentially, winds at this point in time are very calm. They're not moving in the east to west direction. In fact, this is the post-monsoon time period, essentially when we have calm winds. The Western Depression is about to set in. This is the post-monsoon time period. And the wind is actually moving. It is essentially moving in a circular pattern. If you would have opened your IQ Air app in terms of but on the Earth side, so essentially there's a button for that. You can actually see that there is a circular motion of the wind that is, and on days when AQI was significantly higher, it was when the winds were much slower. So essentially, calmer winds were leading to greater AQIs. Also, the natural topography of the Indo-Gangetic Plains is such that it runs parallel to essentially the mountain ranges, so essentially the Himalayan, Hindu Kush, and then the Suleiman range, essentially, and that causes for this. It makes it difficult for the wind to dissipate once again, and so essentially what we see is slow circular motions, whether that circle is on the side of Pakistan, and then we'll essentially see winds coming from India to Pakistan, but then the circle may move towards India, and then we would see winds coming from India to Pakistan, from Pakistan to India, and vice versa. And so essentially, it is a regional problem. Pakistan and India, we saw crop burning on both ends. We saw essentially that there was crop burning, there was lack of management with regards to smog, and we saw that in terms of the AQI levels and the PM 2.5 and PM 10. And so placing blame is really, I think, not the solution.
It's not helping us at all. Okay. No, that clarifies like so much of it. As we kind of like come kind of to the close of this, अगर आप लाहौर में इस वक्त ट्रैवल करते हैं तो इतने ज़्यादा फ्लाईओवर्स और ब्रिजेस और मतलब एंडलेस है वो, और आप ऊपर देखते हैं तो बुरे दिनों पे तो आपको कुछ भी नजर नहीं आएगा, राइट, लेकिन अच्छे दिनों पे आपको हाउसिंग सोसाइटी का बोर्ड नजर आ जाएगा क्योंकि वो हर जगह है, it's ubiquitous, it's everywhere. And I've been wanting to make this list just of all the names, like, and put it somewhere like in my writing. ये जो सारी surge in development है generally of infrastructure, of bridges, of roads, of flyovers, who is it benefiting and who remains outside the periphery of this center जो ये develop हो रहा है?
So I think based on what Mariam has so clearly explained, I think it's quite clear that it is harming a lot of people, right? Which is this excessive construction activity, the movement of loose earth which goes with it, so all of the particulate matter and sort of the dust that rises up with it. So the connection with the smog situation is actually very clear, right? So I think that becomes very apparent. But it obviously is benefiting a lot of people, right? And the benefits, by lot I mean in a relatively narrow, in a very narrow sense. Otherwise, it wouldn't be happening. So who has it benefited really? If you look at sort of existing research carried out by scholars like Fiza Sajjad and Hala Bashir Malik, it's very clear that the nature of real estate development in Pakistan, it caters to certain sort of high income socioeconomic sort of segments, and they stand to benefit the most because they have the excess capital and liquidity that they can invest in the real estate sector and then generate sizable returns off of it, right? But to make real estate attractive, there is an accompanying element of public infrastructure that goes into it as well.
Exactly.
So मैं एक scheme बनाता हूँ that's 40 kilometers from the city. Its value as an investment can only be realized when the government decides to build a highway that goes to it, or it builds a ring road that incorporates it into sort of transport related mobility, or it eases up access to it in some form or the other. Right? So I'll give you, there's a small example that over the last 5 years, for those of you from Lahore, obviously those of you who are listening and from Lahore, they will know that between Kalma Chowk and DHA phase 6 and 7, the entire route that runs between it, we have seen public investment of upwards of 40 billion rupees just to turn that corridor into a signal-free zone, right? So you've seen 3 underpasses being built, 2 flyovers built, another alternative route that is currently being built through what is now called the Central Business District, and billions of rupees being added to it. So there's a direct beneficiary, which are obviously all the construction companies that are getting contracts, and that's a way in which This is a completely different topic, but that's the way in which political patronage is dispersed in countries like Pakistan. But then there are the sort of the beneficiaries of the service, right? Which are car owners, private vehicle owners, and those who live and commute between these two areas. Between these areas. Okay? So there is, there's a very interesting video that just recently came out of a of a government employee, of a government sort of representative, who was talking about this new route that is being built again from Gulberg all the way up to Defence, and it'll cut travel time down to 7 minutes or 8 minutes. And the argument that is given in favor of it is that people who are coming from that end to this end will now be able to come in 8 minutes. Right?
Yeah, exactly.
But the fact of the matter is that it's less than 10% of the population that lives in that part of the city, right?
Yeah.
So this entire model of development is very narrow.
Yeah.
It caters to a small segment of the socioeconomic and politically privileged segments of society. And the disproportionate use of resources tends to cater to those who have access to privatized means of transport, specifically to cars, right? जो flyovers हैं और underpasses हैं and signal-free corridors जो हैं, they cater to those who have cars and who can sort of commute from one place to another. Yeah. Who is it against? It is against, for example, the pedestrian. So the person who was earlier able to cross a street on the basis of a traffic light now is simply unable to do it. It is even against private sort of people who own motorbikes, because the average speed of traffic has now increased so much that it poses a serious risk to people who are on two-wheelers or three-wheelers, right? Yeah. So this and obviously it's harming everyone in some ways because of increased transport emissions, because of increased construction-related emissions, and so on. So really, there's a great sort of need for a systematic reevaluation of our model of urban development. Where are we putting money into? Are we putting money into projects that are catering to a small sliver of the population, that are catering to some aesthetic of what a good city is supposed to look like? The optics of the city, exactly. Or is there a need to tackle the real tangible issues of poor air quality, poor urban service delivery, of solid waste management, of sanitation and water provision, that are actually existential problems?
Exactly.
Standing at a traffic light may be annoying for some, but it's not going to reduce my lifespan in the way that smog, for example, or poor water quality are going to, right? So I think that really is the trade-off. It's a very stark trade-off, but it's one that our sort of decision makers seem perfectly happy and sort of are happy to make it that way, right?
Yeah, absolutely. अगर government का response देखा जाए towards smog, and we look at Punjab's 10-year smog initiative, is this effective? Is this an effective response? इसकी कुछ चीजें अच्छी हैं, कुछ चीजें बुरी हैं, क्या आपका ख्याल है इस बारे में?
Okay, so there were, if we think about government responses to smog, there was firefighting during the smog period, and then there are some long-term plans that you talk about. So in the short run, during the smog period, the government imposed several restrictions and had some policies. So we had a ban on crop burning, we had ban on brick kilns, we had green lockdowns in 4 designated areas of Lahore, which meant banning construction there, banning, chinchis, banning barbecues, banning even dry sweeping of the floor.
Saying weddings and what? Really?
Yes, literally. And so essentially, when those green lockdowns didn't work in those specific areas, we had time-based lockdowns all across the city and district. And so essentially we had a complete ban on, weddings, post 10 p.m. Post 10 p.m., even though we already have that ban. Markets, restaurants, construction activities, ban on all of that, and then ban on primary and secondary schools. Primary and secondary schools were not closed down, closed down. Not because to reduce smog, but because it was a public health emergency. And then we had cloud seeding. So cloud seeding was done.
This is done last year, right?
Cloud seeding was also done this year. Artificial rain was done in parts of Jhelum and Gujarat this year. And so essentially, while we saw that bricks were easily available this year, and the ban didn't really help, we also saw crop burning videos all across the motorway. So that ban didn't work. Cloud seeding now is something that may or may not work, and it's so very tricky in that sense. And so we can't rely on it. What is also something that what is also a problem with cloud seeding is that it's a short-lived solution. So essentially, this year we had the government did cloud seeding and artificial rainfall on Saturday, and on Sunday we had lower AQI levels, and it was a moment of relief for us all. But then they increased back on Thursday, and so essentially it was very short-lived. What is also important in terms of technicalities is that when we do cloud seeding, it does relieve air pollutants for some time, but what it leads towards is that thunderstorms lead towards greater nitrogen oxide creation, and so essentially that leads to greater smog formation.
So eventually it's causing more smog.
Exactly. While these are short-term measures, what we need to understand is that air pollution is a year-long problem, and while the natural phenomena that I explained causes for us to see and smell and breathe in smog at a higher level during these certain months, it doesn't mean that we don't have the air pollutants all throughout the year. And so essentially we need year-long solutions. We need to address the emissions. We need to address larger policies. And so that relates closely to what you've been talking about in terms of urban areas specifically also. And the government needs to move past that firefighting that we do at the last minute when no one can absolutely breathe. Yes, exactly. And so when we look at the long-term solutions and long-term plans, there have been long-term plans that the government has had in the past as well. We had the Smog plan. We had a Smog commission in 2017. We have national ambient air quality standards have been set. There have been things happening in the past. And then in 2023, we had the National Clean Air Policy, followed by provincial level plans as well. And the focus of these was on different sectors, 5 sectors specifically, the transport, and it had a goal for each. So for example, for transport, the goal was to move towards Euro 5 and Euro 6 standard fuel. For industries, it was enforce emission standards. For agriculture, it was prevent crop burning, and so on. And so, and then just recently, last month, I think we had a new mitigation plan that you just mentioned, the 10-year plan, right? Now, the thing is that if we analyze the clean air policy and the clean air plan and the provincial level plan, they did seem to be in the right direction. They had a lot of details that were important and necessary, which includes moving industrial areas further away from the city. And so all of those large-scale changes that are needed, but then we didn't see a commitment to it. And so we didn't see a commitment to it. We didn't see a conviction to address this issue. Small things like air quality monitors were to be installed by 2024 in different, it hasn't happened yet. And then we see the same kind of scenario when we look at the mitigation plan now. So essentially in this mitigation plan, I have some examples to explain this. We see, for example, for the agricultural sector, to address the issue of crop residue burning, the government suggested essentially bringing in 5,000 super seeders and 2,000 rice straw shredders. And essentially, and this is something that's supposed to be bought in by the farmers at a subsidized rate. So we know that many farmers will not be able to afford it. And then this is just a few number of seeders as opposed to the 2.5 million hectares of just rice cultivated land that exists. And so essentially it's really not a lot. If we look at the transport sector, the mitigation plan focuses on bringing in 27 electric buses. 27. And so imagine in this large city like Lahore, and by the way, this smog is not just in Lahore, it's also, we saw it in Multan, we saw it in southern Punjab, everywhere. But this was just 27 electric buses in Lahore and 8,200 bikes, motorbikes, electric bikes, as opposed to the 17.5 million that are already registered. And so essentially what we see are these policies are in place, but then at the same time, they're kind of missing the mark exactly. And on top of it, they continue to act as guidelines in terms of fuel quality. There is this is a 10-year plan. So not even in the immediate time, but in the 5 to 10 years time, moving to Euro 5 and Euro 6 standard fuel continues to be a requests that will be made to the federal government. And also there is no plan, or there's nothing mentioned with regards to how Euro 4 is imported, but then it gets mixed in with the Euro 2 and other low quality oils to counter that problem. And then the larger problem is that these remain to be guidelines and things that we should act upon. There's no legal backing behind it also. No implementation, but also no legal backing, no laws behind it. And so it continues to be a problem that we need to resolve.
So there's a lot of basically stuff that's work left to be done in terms of implementation and actually seeing like effective change.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Yeah, it's like a lot. Like I'm literally overwhelmed with these numbers. Or what numbers are the bikes? How many?
8,200.
And the EV buses are how many?
27.
27. This I can't see.
27 in this population. The last thing I want to ask, इसी से linked है. What lessons? Again, broad questions. And I'm sorry, in this whole episode, I'm throwing these like broad questions. जिनके लिए multiple podcasts होनी चाहिए. What lessons can Pakistan learn from countries that have done this better, like specifically, dealing with like urbanization and urban growth?
So there is, one thing that we've learned, and by studying scholars who've looked at these questions deeply, is that there's no one blueprint. There's no one blueprint of what sustainable urbanization or what a sort of a problem solved sort of city would look like. I think every place has its own set of problems. But there are certain things that we know are important, right? The first is that a city cannot be run on the whims of a select few, and especially a select few who are essentially unelected bureaucrats. So the existence of elected local governments is probably just the first and the most fundamental solution to the problem. That if you have a problem of smog which is relevant to a particular locality, let the representatives of those populations actually sort of try to deal with it, right? If there are water quality issues, then those water quality issues need to be resolved at the level of the neighborhood, at the level of the community, not based on some provincial government department that is being set up somewhere, and being given to the bureaucracy. So the first and fundamental condition is that you need local governments that are empowered fiscally, financially, and administratively. Okay. So I think and we fail on that mark repeatedly, and we've sort of
there was last time कि नहीं अब ज़्यादा
autonomy दी जाएगी, बनाया जाएगा, but वो नहीं होता, right? So there's the current political economy configuration is such that it doesn't allow for local governments to emerge or sustainable local governments to emerge in the first place. So that's the first one. The second is closely related to this, is that you need to improve the access of weaker socioeconomic segments in policy making, which in other words means enhancing their voice on these concerns, right? Why is it that large tracts of rural land are being converted for low density, upper income, gated housing communities instead of, medium density, mid-rise, adequate housing for large segments of the population, right? And this is, for me, it's a fundamentally a demand issue, which is people's requirements are not being met because they don't have voice and access in the way that decision making is carried out. So that is closely associated with this. Third, I think we need to really push on how the real estate sector actually operates, and there is some sort of work that is being done already, which is that real estate development needs to move past this paradigm of empty plots and files, which actually perpetuates speculative accumulation, as many scholars have talked about, and instead focuses on delivering actual adequate housing to people who really need it, right? And this again requires government intervention in various forms, either through regulatory standards, कि भाई you can't just build a housing scheme in the air and distribute plots and files to people, but rather that there should be requirements of timelines, there should be requirements of density, there should be requirements and bylaws that allow and enable more sort of affordable housing to actually emerge in the first place. And then finally, I think when we come to the issue of urban service delivery, the 2 or 3 main issues that we've talked about, solid waste management, sanitation, and water, there needs to be sort of a clear recognition of the fact that this poses an existential threat to the population, right? And without resolving these issues, And these aren't glamorous issues to resolve.
Exactly.
Hmm.
No
These
one's
aren't
talking
issues-
about them as
Exactly.
existential
These
threats.
aren't issues जिनके ऊपर आप एक तख्ती लगा के credit ले सकते हैं. They aren't issues
Yes.
that you can put on a campaign
Politician
poster,
photo.
right? Nobody puts a clean water pipe on a
Yes.
campaign poster,
Haan.
but you can put a large, big sort of flyover or an underpass
Exactly.
on a campaign poster. So I think the fact is that it requires recognition. It requires an understanding of the problem. That without fixing the water crisis, without fixing the sanitation crisis, without fixing the solid waste management crisis, we won't really be able to fix the urban crisis as a whole, right? And I think, so I think greater recognition of that problem. So these 3 or 4 things have to happen, almost, they have to happen at the same time. They also they require a recognition that has been missing so far. And they require constant vigilance and sort of greater voice from populations that are most affected by issues such as smog or by poor water quality, inadequate housing, and so on.
No, thanks very much. I think that was so comprehensive, and I think the words I'm taking away are glamorous issues versus unglamorous issues, right? Like we need to work on the unglamorous issues, like solid waste management, like water, etc. But thank you so much, both of you. Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Mariam. Thanks so much for making this episode so kind of holistic. Like, I really think I've learned so much that I didn't know, and I hope our viewers also will learn so much. Thank you for being here. Thank you for watching this episode and for watching our previous episode. We hope to keep working like this to bring such conversations to you. And it's been wonderful that our guests gave us so much time. And I look forward to seeing you again. Stay tuned for more episodes. Thank you very much.